Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
All right, well, in the interest of time, because we just have 45 minutes, I'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Jonathan Woodrow. I'm a volunteer moderator with the fair. I'm an alum of Aspen High School, class of 2011, and I'm an alum of Amherst College, class of 2015. And Kate will appreciate that I played 4 years of football for a coach who's still there and kind of a local legend, and went 4-0 against arch rival Williams College. Well, first question for the panelists is, we've been told that an admissions officer spends approximately 8 to 15 minutes per application. So if one of you could share your thoughts on this process, and what should students concentrate on to maximize the effectiveness of an admissions officer's read time?
I can go ahead and start with that, Jonathan. Hi, everybody. My name is Katrina Bruno. I prefer to go by Kat. I work at Pomona College. I'm one of the assistant deans there. And I'd love to spend a moment to talk about this. So typically and generally, about 8 to 10 minutes is what you will find admission officers are spending time on when it comes to applications. But we have to keep in mind that every school has their own way of reading applications. For example, I'll talk about maybe 2 ways that you may or may not be familiar with. At a couple of the schools even represented here, we have what's called committee-based evaluation, where 2 people in tandem will be reading your application at the same time. One individual tends to take on the more qualitative aspects of the application and review, and the other individual tends to take on more of the quantitative aspects, thus having a conversation regarding the application as a whole before deciding whether to move that on to a future round, whether they're going to admit that student, waitlist the student, perhaps defer the student if it's in an early process, or decline the student. There are other institutions as well that will read individually. So one admission officer will begin the review process by spending a lot of critical time taking a very detailed look on their own at all the different parts of the application process. And again, those are only 2 kind of ways to highlight, but there may be some other ways that folks are engaging with your application. So in terms of really maximizing the time with your application, I mean, we have a lot of, several requirements that are part of the application, be it the transcripts, the recommendation letters, the essays. So I think that just making sure that you're using those spaces to the capacity that you can. If you're using any, or if you're providing any additional information as well, maybe to explain any nuances that may have occurred, especially, that being a kind of wonky couple of years for some students in their schools. Making sure that you're using that space to clarify anything that might be a little bit different or odd or standing out. So those are a couple of ways I think that you can really maximize that space. I'm happy to answer any questions towards the end of the presentation.
Thanks, Kat. And next question. We've heard that most highly selective schools have many more qualified applicants than they do accepted students. One, is this true? And if so, what are some differences between qualified applicants that are ultimately accepted and those not accepted?
So I volunteered to take this question, and now I'm wondering why. but I will go ahead, and please grill us at the end, okay? Because we will answer any questions as specifically as you want. But I think probably that the definition of highly selective, right, is we don't take more. We take fewer people. We admit fewer people than we don't admit. I was going to use the word reject, but that's my least favorite word. So I'm going to avoid that word whenever possible. So by the nature of highly selective, our schools, for probably, for a lot of reasons, have many more applications than we could admit. But what I always try to remind people is it's not a judgment on a person's ability to be successful. So what I suggest, and I think, I'm seeing already some slightly nodding heads, but of the students we don't admit, those students could also do well and contribute at our colleges and universities, right? So we're not admitting someone, we're not saying that person isn't qualified or isn't able or wouldn't thrive in our environments. But the reality is we're small schools. I know each year at Amherst, we want to admit 2 or 3 times as many students as we can, right? But I think we'd get in really big trouble if we did that. So we have to be really precise in the students we admit and then go to the wait list to fill the rest of the class. So how are students different? Frankly, I mean, if you all, I mean, for students and for parents, if you think of students who were admitted at different colleges last year that you knew, there might have been a student who was top of the class who was not admitted somewhere, and someone who was like in the middle of the class who was admitted at that same school. And if you can't figure it out, and it isn't a formula, it isn't based exclusively on standardized testing and grades and classes. It's much more nuanced than that when we're building a class. So we're looking to build a class of students from all over the country and from all over the world. And we also want a class of people who are not just like me, right? It would be so boring if everyone in Amherst were just like me, and thank God they're not, right? They have different perspectives, different backgrounds, different life experiences. So the conversations in the classroom and in the residence halls, as a result, are enriched because of the diversity of experience and individuals that are in those classes. So when we're thinking about who we're admitting, the students who tend to be the most successful, who are those who are going to be prepared. That's like the bottom line, right? But again, of our applicant pool, probably 95% of the students that apply to Amherst could do well at Amherst, right? So then beyond that, what are we looking for? And it could be this year we're looking for, Jonathan, what position did you play?
Offensive line.
We could be looking for an offensive lineman, or we could be looking for a first chair cellist, or an amazing artist, or most likely, because most of the students don't have some special attribute. I know that that's a question we might talk about later. We're just looking for a well-rounded student. And of the students that we admit, this is kind of where I think we sort of deserve this in some way. They don't all come to our schools. So we'll be in this, this small committee that Kat was talking about, right? And talked about it really well. And we have these great conversations and we're advocating for students. Then yes, the student's admitted. And then we admit the student, we're so excited, and they turn us down to go to Duke or wherever else they're going. So it's one of the reasons that your college counselors really encourage you to have a list, a broad list and a wide list of colleges. So you have schools that are highly selective and those that are considered likely schools. I think that some other really good advice that I'll give before I turn it over to the next panelist is the schools that are the schools you're likely to be admitted to, those schools you should also be excited about. So you should never apply to a college that you're not excited about. So if you get into a school that's your safety and you're like, oh man, I don't want to go to this school, you don't want to be in that position. Only apply to schools that you're really excited about attending. I'll stop there. We could talk about each of these topics for hours, but I won't.
Thanks, Kate. And next question, to what extent are extracurricular activities important? And do your institutions ultimately want students who are well-rounded in and of themselves, or do you want students who are really good at one particular thing, who many of whom could perhaps collectively make the institution itself a bit more well-rounded?
Happy to take this one. So good morning, everybody. My name is Christy Pratt. I'm the Director of Undergraduate Admissions for the University of Notre Dame. And for extracurriculars, the one thing to keep in mind with that is the very first word of that, it's extra. These are things that you are participating inside and outside of your high school, and they add context to your application. They give us an insight into what you're doing with your time outside of when you are in the classroom, but they are just that piece of they are extra. They are never going to, as we might like to call it, raise the dead, meaning that if you have not taken a challenging coursework, if you have not done well in those courses with strong grades, an extracurricular is never going to be able to completely overshadow those academic preparations for a highly selective institution like my institution, and also my panelist institutions along with others as well. So the term well-rounded, we've all heard that, and when you ask a student that, they will roll their eyes of what does well-rounded mean. You know, back in the 90s and early 2000s, well-rounded meant that you were in lots of clubs in your high school. And so that was to be able to get your picture in your books. Not so much anymore, because we have social media. But what we are looking for is, you know, what is it that you are truly passionate about? And so it's not so much quantity, but more quality. So for instance, if you are really passionate about music and you are in your high school marching band, you're maybe section leader, and that you teach tuba to the elderly on Thursdays as your volunteering passionate part of that, then we know on the college side that that's something that is very important to you. We can see by the amount of hours when you fill that part out on your application. We know that that is something that truly is a passion of yours. You know, the other part that we see students that oftentimes will overlook is their family responsibilities. One of my favorites last year was a student that wrote Awesome Big Brother. And the explanation for that was he was the oldest of 6 children. I know what that student is doing. When he comes home, he's helping with dinner, he's helping with siblings' homework, he's helping probably with bath time. And then probably around 11 o'clock or maybe even midnight is when he is able to then turn to his own studies. Don't ever discount your family responsibilities and what you do for your family. The other things don't discount part-time jobs. Don't also discount if you have a large commute, and for especially our students in Colorado, you may have that where you're driving at long distances to go to your high schools and so forth. So those are all parts that give context to your application to let us know what you're doing outside of the classroom. We're not looking for one specific thing, but we are looking for you to give us a glimpse into your life and what you're doing. And if that you're able to, if you're able to be able to display within those leadership opportunities that you've had, how you are helping out within your community, and you know, just things that you're really passionate about that show the different sides of you. Those are the things that we're looking for in your application. So there's no magic answer or magic formula. We're not looking for that. We're just really be able to get more of an understanding about you and how you're going to be able to bring those interests and passions and leadership and all of those things to our own respective campuses to be able to engage in our community and continue to expand that.
Thank you, Chrissy. And Mark, I'll direct this next question to you. What do you look for in admissions essays, and what do you look for in teacher recommendation letters?
Absolutely. So these are the other parts that really help us round out our review of an application file and really in many ways get to know you in the best possible way. So when it comes to the latter of those, looking at teacher letters of recommendation, we're looking for things that provide us context about you as a student beyond just what we see on an academic transcript. So on the transcript, we know you took a class, we know what grade you got in the class, but how students arrive at that, how they are in classes, you know, what was produced to arrive at that final thing is what we hope to get from the letter. Because when we're looking at our jobs as admissions officers, we are bringing students to our universities for faculty, for staff, for organization leaders and such. And getting a sense of how you are in the classroom is really what teachers are able to provide. So we're looking for information about you as a student in that academic environment and setting. With highly selective institutions in particular, we want to make sure that that academic match is there with students, and teachers are really well equipped to provide that information to us. And speaking as somebody who is actually the son of a teacher, you know, I always encourage students not to wait on this process. When it comes down to reaching out for teachers, typically, you know, the more notice you can give them, the better. Teachers are very busy people, so give them a heads up. And then when you actually reach out, I would encourage you to ask them to share information about you as a student in that classroom. My mother is a great Spanish teacher, but she's not necessarily a great letter of recommendation writer because that's not her job. She's doing it in the evening, she's doing this over the weekends. So when you reach out for a teacher, you know, not only say, hey, I'd love to have a letter of recommendation if you don't mind, but if possible, could you talk about that one group project that I did where we turned in a first draft that wasn't so great, and then we really worked our tails off, and then we had that great final thing. So those are the anecdotes and examples that we hope to see. These teachers don't necessarily have to be the teachers who gave you the highest grade in a subject or for the highest level class that you took if you don't really know them that well. We do see a lot of application letters that'll say, well, the student got an A, they were on time, and that's about it. And that's sort of a missed opportunity. So with letters of recommendation and with every other part of the application, we hope students view them as an opportunity to convey more information about themselves to us. Now, all schools are going to have different policies regarding who can write a letter, what the recommendations are, and how many letters can be, submitted by students there. So of course, check with each of the schools on your list and see what they're listing as requirements and expectations and recommendations there. But don't wait on this. If you're a senior, reach out about now, because teachers are going to start getting really, really busy here. And you want to make sure that you're not coming to them at the last minute asking for an extra letter, because letters that have a late date on the very top typically tend to be a bit more shorter and rushed from our end. But this should be something that we hope should not be stressful. As you think back to your entire high school career, there should be those relationships with teachers, those academic settings and engagements that you're proud of, that you would like to have expanded upon. And that's exactly what that letter provides. Now, the essays are also going to be very different school to school. Many colleges are going to require just the standard personal essay from either application, about 650 words or so. Many other colleges are going to have supplements. I remember as an applicant back in the day, some colleges said on a blank sheet of paper, convey yourself to us. And some colleges notoriously have some very interesting questions like, would you rather fight a duck-sized horse or a 100-sized, like things like that. So they're all going to be a little bit different, but this should be another opportunity for you to share a little bit about yourself with the prospective college that you're applying to. Now, this is something where we're not really trying to knock students down. We really just want to get to know you. So however you see best as far as format, as far as content, if you want to be serious, if you want to be personal, if you want to be funny. I mean, so long as it's professional, so long as you're writing with the standards of good grammar and conveying appropriately to us, the vast majority of essays we read are great, and that's perfectly wonderful. And that is our hope, just a way to get a sense of who you are, what your motivations are, what your experiences mean, what perspectives you have, and what you're going to bring to our college campuses. So with both of these, again, I hope that these are relatively low stress things. Look at all parts of an application as an opportunity when it comes to providing information to us.
And in submitting my application, should I be also providing supplementary materials such as a YouTube link or a piece of artwork? Kat, I'll give that one to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So many institutions will have the option to submit what are called supplemental art supplements or something along those lines, very similar. Whereas as part of your application, you can tack on some additional information about perhaps any skills or passions that you may have that fall within the music sphere, dance, theater, and the visual arts typically. I know I can speak for Pomona in saying that when you submit an art supplement, it will be reviewed by an actual faculty member. So it's not like Kat Bruno is determining whether you know how to play the piano or not, because she cannot do that. But we are actually having them reviewed by our faculty, and they provide some feedback on how they feel that you might be contributing to their orchestras or their ensembles, what kind of role you might play within a certain department, etc. So I could say that generally these art supplements that you submit could be helpful towards your application. As Kate mentioned earlier, sometimes there are needs to fill within particular spaces on campus, whether it is we need a new, we need an organ player, a tuba player, or we need folks who are going to come in and be able to be part of the theater performances, etc. So it could add a bit of an extra kind of ting to your application if it is reviewed successfully during the application process. But I know that at least within our institution, again, it's hard to speak for everybody, that if you submit a art supplement that is just, it's not reviewed maybe well or highly, it doesn't necessarily negatively impact your application. It really only can help you if you are determined to have a talent in these areas.
The only thing that I'll add to that is that art supplement portfolios are very school specific of what they want to see and what majors that they will review it for. So you definitely need to look on our respective college websites to see what it is that we allow for those and how they are reviewed. For your question, Jonathan, about adding YouTube links, I can tell you that especially for Notre Dame and a lot of our highly selective colleagues, that if you put a YouTube link into your Common App essay, it's not going to be clicked on because we unfortunately do not have the time to be able to go to that and be able to look at it. So really don't be adding those things unless the school is asking for. And I think that's the other part of this is give us what we're asking for. Try not to give us a lot more than that, because we unfortunately just do not have the available staff and the available time to be going through and digging into those.
Thanks. And withstanding that there's also a kind of an entire separate workshop on this, I was also asked to have the panelists touch on the question of how optional is test optional at your institutions.
So I'll start, but we can do a speed round. So at Amherst, test optional. So we actually, before the pandemic, we all colleges do a ton of research, right? We don't make decisions without making data informed decisions. So we were beginning to do a ton of research looking at testing, and we realized that we were overemphasizing testing in our holistic review. So holistic review is really important. There are no formulas. So we're looking at students within context of their high school, within context of their family, within context of the country, et cetera. And with the context of what's going on in their lives. And so we were looking at testing, and then COVID came, bam, right? And it wasn't safe for students to take tests. And man, even if a student could take a test, I can't imagine being in a room and having someone next to you sneeze. You're thinking, uh-oh. You remember that a year and a half ago? That was like, if someone sneezed, that was like you were gonna, it was terrifying. So most, if not all of us, went test optional at that point. My hope is we'll continue, but we have to do data, look at the data, and make sure that we're admitting students in a way that the students we're admitting are going to be successful on our campus. And if they're not, what can we do to make them successful? So we'll look very intentionally at how students are, the students who chose not to submit their testing, how they're thriving on campus. But test optional means just that. So if we see someone submitted the test and someone didn't submit the test, it's not a negative if someone didn't submit the test. They just didn't submit the test. Some students here in this room may feel like the tests that they're taking don't represent them as a student. You know, I've heard the expression, I'm not a good test taker. And if you're in that category, at least for Amherst, then you don't need to submit the tests. If you take the test, you're like, oh my gosh, how did I ever get the score? This is amazing. I'm so excited about this. Then you might want to submit that score if you had a good day that day. But it's part of a holistic review. I think, as Christy might have said, I forget, there's so much good advice going on here from my colleagues, but it's not like an all or nothing. So testing is a part of many, many things we review again in this holistic review.
Thanks. That's great advice here. And just to add on, and I'm not trying to finish thoughts, but to link these together, I think you're going to see the word optional, not just with testing, but with many pieces of many college applications. Now, every college is more or less free to do things as they see fit. Many highly selective universities, or some I should say, still require testing. And even if you're applying to a school which may be test optional, they might have a scholarship program that requires standardized testing. Or if you're looking at the ROTC program, that might still require standardized testing. So with all of these things here, as much advanced research as you're able to do as possible is going to provide you the full context in which you make these decisions. But whenever you see the word optional there, be it for testing or for standardized or supplements or additional letters or interviews or whatever might have the optional flag there, we really mean optional. So my recommendation to students is if you look at the application and you think my application is incomplete without these optional things, then don't feel like you have to do it. Optional doesn't mean you really should do this. A lot of times students will say like, well, I don't really have a passion for arts, but should I submit something in? It's like, well, no, of course not. It's something that if you feel like your application is incomplete without that optional thing, that it is why it is there for you. But if your application is fully complete, you're happy with it without those optional pieces, even if that's standardized testing, then don't submit them. So it's really about finding the balance for you, finding that sort of place where you feel like your application reflects who you are, conveys who you are to us. If you're happy with it, if you're ready to put the bow on it, nothing optional, that's perfectly fine.
One other piece that I think that we also need to touch upon there are some institutions that are test blind. And test blind means that even if you do want to have your score incorporated in that review, the school is not going to look at it. Probably the most famous right now is the UC system. So just be aware that similar to admissions plans where you have the 31 different flavors, it seems, you also have that now with testing. So there are test optional, which is exactly what Kate and Mark were saying about that it is completely optional. Then you have test blind, which means they're not going to look at it even if you do attempt to submit it. And then there's different variations within that. The one thing that I also think we should be able to tell people is that if a school is test optional with their ACT and SAT, typically that doesn't mean that it's preventing you from submitting advanced placement exam scores or international baccalaureate scores. So those are still available for you. It's just typically whenever a school says it is test optional, it's specifically talking about the ACT or the SAT.
Thanks. And the last question before we turn it over to Q&A for the panelists is how do you encourage students to spend their summers? And I guess I'll add on, how have you seen applicants, do a great job of articulating how they spent their summers? And anyone can take that.
I'm happy to, I'll start it off. So, the summers, the one thing you have to remember, you're still students in high school, and we want you to be able to enjoy your summers because all of us on this panel, we're all adults, and I think we would all love to not be adults any longer. So enjoy your summers. Do something that allows you to be able to relax, to get sleep. We're all seeing a mental health crisis within this country for students that are in high school that feel like they're constantly on this treadmill, sit on 10, and that they just can't get ahead. Summer should allow you to be able to relax, breathe, do something that is good for you and good for your mental health. That could be a lifeguard, that could be a part-time job, that could be some type of like a pre-college program where it's something that you're interested in learning more about. So any of all that, and it also could just be you're helping your family out with looking after younger siblings, or you're training in your sport because you're thinking of going to that next level and maybe going for some type of a division 1, 2, or 3, or even 4 team, at the college level. But there's no prescription for what you need to do over the summer. In terms of how you can put that on your application, there's a couple different ways. You can list those in extracurriculars. There's also, especially if you've done some type of like a pre-college program over a summer, that you can list that. Usually you can do that underneath the educational section, or it can be in that extracurricular section. You can also do it as an additional info section as long as it is short and brief, because that additional info section is not meant to be able to basically be a whole separate application. It's there to provide additional info. But again, we want to have students that are ready and happy and ready to go whenever they hit our campuses, not continually already be at the brink of their mental health. And so I think summers are a really good way for students to just be teenagers and enjoy that time and get that downtime that they so desperately need in order to continue to do well.
Would any of the other panelists like to add to that prior to moving over to Q&A? If not, I think the group size here is such that we can probably just open it up informally to Q&A for the panelists, but please also feel free to type a question in the chat as well, and I can do my best to get to those and read them out.
If you don't mind, actually, I got a question sent to me that I think could be of group benefit to the group. But please, folks, let us know what questions you have, text or unmute yourself. I got a question asking a little bit more about the essays. And when students are maybe selecting an essay, for many colleges, they encourage them to be open-ended. And if that's the case, how do you select an essay that might not be too risky, as it were? So having done this for 6 years or so now, I mean, it's something like 12 or 14,000 or so application essays that I've run across. I can only recall 2 that I would say were inappropriate, and for very clear, obvious reasons. And one was rather graphic and crude and things like that. So when it comes down to it, really, so long as that's not where you've landed, it's going to be perfectly fine. I think some students are more willing to share than others. So students will often ask, am I oversharing here? And that can certainly be a thing, but for every student, that's different. It's not a one size fits all approach for everybody. So, if you're willing to allow, other friends or family members or your college counselor to see the text of the essay, that can be a good way to gauge these things too. But for many students, they're not. And I saw a tweet not too long ago that my deepest, darkest secrets will remain between me and the admissions officer who read my application. So we certainly get a good amount of these here. So if that's what you would like to share, you're welcome to. If that's part of your story, if that's part of your narrative, your perspective, and something you would like to share with us, you're absolutely welcome to. We don't expect to see it. If that's not something you're comfortable sharing, that's also perfectly fine. So if you're somebody who might want to take a risk, in whatever sense that might be, so long as it's not getting to the, I'd say, crude or graphic or profane side of things, that's perfectly fine. But you don't have to take risks. If that's not in your nature, if you're not comfortable doing that, don't feel like you have to go outside of your wheelhouse, outside of your comfort zone in this application process. Above all else, we want this application to be true to you. So if that's who you are and that's true to you, take the risk. If not, that's perfectly fine.
Thanks, Mark. And I got a question in the chat, and that's what's the best way to gauge the extent to which an institution and one of your institutions is the right fit for me without necessarily being able to take a physical visit to the campus?
I'll start with that, and you guys can jump on. That is a great question. I mean, applying in the time of COVID is incredibly challenging. So some of us are open now for visits, but maybe buildings might not be open, but that wasn't the question. So if you can't come to campus, once you're admitted, don't forget, well, unless you apply early decision. So let me start over again. Visit virtually. We all have virtual programs. Most of us have virtual information sessions. We have virtual tours. I mean, it's not a great substitute, but if it's the option, that's kind of the best you can do. If you haven't been to a college campus, you might not feel comfortable applying in a program that commits you to it. So you might not feel comfortable applying to a school early decision if you've never set foot on campus. Although every year we have students who come to campus who've never been there before. What you should try to do is find alumni you can speak with. Some schools might have virtual classrooms. You can sit in on quote unquote a classroom and hear the interaction between a faculty member and a student. I think looking at data, so looking at data points like the student to faculty ratio might or might not be helpful. I mean, after this session, every school is going to have their own individual session where you can plug into schools, even just for a minute, and just ask a brief question to get some data points. But it is hard. It's hard to get to know a school when you're not there. But in this world, it's more and more common. So again, virtual visits. Read blogger sites, talk to tour guides who often will share their emails. You can ask them kind of real questions, if you will, and they'll be very honest. We are paid to say what we say, but I think we're all deeply committed to our schools. And the last thing we want to do is mislead someone. And we're also not about selling our colleges. We want to tell you about what our colleges offer, and then you decide if it's a good fit for you. So we want to make sure we provide that information. So you need to be in charge of the information that you're looking for.
Social media is also a great place to also complement everything that Kate just said. All of us have very prolific social media, everything from Facebook to Instagram to Twitter to TikTok to Snapchat. And most of them have students that are providing content to that and or faculty or staff takeovers. So definitely check those out, keep an eye on them, because that's where you're going to also get to see a lot more flavor from our individual campuses. And you can also ask direct questions, especially when they do, specifically like Instagram live takeovers. You can ask that student of what's it really like to eat in the dining hall? If you have any type of, dietary restrictions, have they been able to, accommodate that? Or how is it like to come from, Colorado all the way to the East Coast, Midwest, Northeast? What's it like to be that far away from home? So absolutely check out social media as well as the YouTube and the individual tours. The one thing I think we'll all say is never pay for a tour. There are different Unfortunately, there are different companies out there that are taking advantage of the pandemic, and you never ever have to pay for a tour or be able to talk to a current student or get any of your answers. That's what all of our admissions offices are here for, and happy to put you in touch with students. So please never pay for a campus tour or to speak to a student.
So one other question I just received in the chat is, panelists, can you touch on, and the question is how to be accepted off of a wait list, but I think I would perhaps rephrase that as to what extent, if I'm an applicant that ends up on a wait list at an institution that I'm excited about, to what extent can I maximize my probability of getting off of said wait list?
That's a great question. Please others join in. Every school, unfortunately, starting with the caveat, is going to be a bit different. And I think that the reality of the wait list is a fundamental reflection of the limits of an institution. So we only have so many dorm rooms, especially at highly selective institutions. We are going to have 100% capacity filled in our class every single year. And in some years, our yield and matriculation rates, the percentage of students who say yes to an offer, is different than it is in other years. So the wait list and deferred list and other things like that are typically enrollment management tools where institutions are able to tell some students saying, you know, you're really high on our list, and you know, if we had more spaces, you would be among the first that we were to take into the class. But we are unfortunately at the point right now where we don't know if we're going to have enough, you know, students who say yes to our offers to fill out that class. So some years at institutions, they will admit students off that wait list, and at other years, it might be none. So it's very school specific, it's very process specific. You know, we actually travel with colleagues from Georgetown University, and they're very open in sharing that the District of Columbia has a very strict rule that they cannot have more than a certain number of students residentially on campus. And if they do, they will risk revoking their land charter. So it's very serious. So this is sort of the reality of where things come from there. So if you do find yourself on the wait list, or the deferred list, know that these colleges are really interested in you. You know, you did not find yourself on this wait list or deferred list accidentally. You earned this space. And even though it might be disappointing in a process where, unfortunately, we have to say no to 90+% of candidates here, to be among the very few placed on that wait list does mean something. And in which case, you should be in contact. So contact your regional admissions officer, contact the office directly. This is not a time to be shy. So even if a school says we're not tracking demonstrated interest, which is seeing how often you engage with us as an applicant, if you find yourself on the wait list, now's the time to reach out, to contact them, to send over updates, to ask questions, and to put into no uncertain terms the level of interest that you have in the school. I mean, if you're genuinely on a wait list for, you know, any of the institutions here or others, and it'd be your top choice, you know, convey that to us and let us know that if you find a space for me, I'm signing on the line, I'm going. So be in touch with us, be in communication with us, let us know what's on your mind. It's always going to be different every single school. It's going to be different every single year. That is the reality of the process. But for those candidates who talk with us, not only are we going to be able to provide you information to answer those questions about what we anticipate, what we expect, what the process is going to look like, but when we do, or if we do wind up going to that wait list to find out those remaining candidates who will join us on campus, you know, we will have you extra high on that list as somebody who's been in regular communication with us.
And just to add, in many cases as well, the colleges will communicate to you how if anything that you need to do for the waitlist. Usually you typically need to formally accept or decline your spot on the waitlist. That's where you'll start. And then I know, at least for my institution, there's clear instructions of when to communicate, what to communicate, to send updates, and just like time frames that you can expect to hear back. So don't be nervous to ask the particular school that you might be waitlisted in very specifically what the expectations are, because again, they could look very different across different institutions as well.
Thanks. And one more question from the chat. Are colleges seeing significantly more applications, or are the same number of students simply applying to more schools due to the Common App?
I think the answer to that is yes and yes. Yeah, all of us saw an increase in applications last year, and I think that definitely was a result of test optional, that it took away barriers for many students who did not feel that their testing was the strongest representation of what they could do, that their transcript spoke more for them. And I do think that students added more universities to their list last year. And all of that is definitely a direct relation to the pandemic, because also many schools last year had different variations of how they were able to open. Some were hybrid, some were completely online, some were in person, and students just didn't know what was going to happen. So they kind of threw their hat into a lot of extra buckets. And this year, we'll see what happens. Most of us are back to a normal operating academic schedule now, and most of us have still kept with test optional, with the exception of some schools that, some state institutions that had to go back to requiring testing due to their state systems. But for the most part, we're back to normal. So it's really for this year, we'll be interested to wait and see what happens with application numbers.
Well, and I think worth following up with a question of like, as we sort of reach a, call it quote unquote post-COVID, normality. I mean, what are you expecting directionally in terms of, just the number of students you'll accept, and then waitlist admits relative to what, historical numbers have been?
I can say for Notre Dame, our first year class is not changing, and that's because we also have a residency requirement. So I only can have a first year class of 2,050 students. So regardless of how many applications I get, I am still restricted by that number. And our yield, and those yielding means the number of offers to those who are end up enrolling, still remains very much the same. So for us, it truly is, it's going to be close to what we've been. I don't know about my fellow panelists, kind of where they're sitting with their first year classes. I'll let them talk.
Same with Amherst. So we had our class size a little bit smaller. We have 473 incoming first year students, but 44 of the students last year decided to defer their admission for a year. And rather than reduce our target first year class, we have 473 plus 44, right? And last year's class was 473 minus 44. So the average will be the same. So this year we have about 17 students who've decided to hold over, but we're not going to change our first year class as a result of that. It will even out eventually. As far as application numbers, it's too early to tell. I wish maybe the students here can tell us what they think it's going to be.
Similar for Pomona, we are sticking to our target, which tends to be about 415 to 420 incoming students for a first year class. And so it's not going to be heavily affected by what's happened previously.
Great. Well, any last questions? Any last things that the panelists would like to add? I know we're right at the 45-minute mark, so want to be sensitive to that. But feel free to shout or type in the chat if there's any last questions from the audience.
Can I just add something really quickly?
Go ahead.
Do you guys think that the test optional applicants that were accepted gave more depth to your universities than you would have found if testing had still been going on?
I think, sorry, please and others join in. It's an interesting question. And I think, when we all saw huge increases in our applicant pool this past year, which actually was not universal. I mean, most colleges did, but some colleges actually didn't. They saw decreased application sizes. But either way, I think it's sort of hard to just focus on that one part. I mean, we had an additional 10,000 applicants this past year, and the strength of the students who joined us on campus. I mean, we saw many different things among this class of 2025 that we hadn't seen, and some of it may or may not be because of that one piece of testing. It's really sort of hard to look at a college application file and all of these aspects and facets of a student. The application file comes out to be like 40 or 50 pages long. And then to take out one little thing and fully say that it was because of this or not because of this, that we saw the effect that we have. But, I think for it's very likely, just speaking anecdotally with students individually, for some, this was the case for them, and now they're with us on campus. So I suspect that that's true down the line. To what extent, to what number, it's hard to say. It's a long process. It's a very people-focused process. There's many, many things within the process itself.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. And thank you
Thank
very
you,
much,
everybody.
panelists. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Goodbye, all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Fine.